In the recollection of history, when you get great figures such as Arthur Wellesley, there's an inevitable effect of a sort of caricature that gets created, especially as these people become removed from the context of their own time and become subject to the interpretations of people who neither grew up nor really recognised the tenor or the people of the time period that is being represented. And that can lead to a simplification of people and of their own personalities, which I think can be sometimes a bit misleading. So one of the points that I wanted to make, which came to my mind when I watched the Ridley Scott's Napoleon recently, where Arthur Wellesley is depicted rather erroneously, I think, as this sneering, miserable aristocrat with this ridiculous look on his face throughout the entire thing. I think a lot of people miss, because that sort of mask of stoicism, which is very common and almost expected of men, and especially of authority figures of that sort of late Edwardian Victorian era, this indefatigable mask that shows no bother or stress in times of great peril, that people, especially now, can come away with the idea that that is an accurate representation of the man himself. And from the reading that I've done from that, I think it's very clear that this is not true. So I've got a few examples that I want to run through to illustrate my point. Events that show, I think, the true heart of the Duke of Wellington as a man, and that I think, in contrast to some other characters, even of his contemporaries like Napoleon, I think he seems to be much more sentimental than people give him credit for. So it's kind of the first time that the British have properly gone on the offensive under Wellington's command, because they'd previously pushed into Spain in the previous year, where they'd fought the Battle of Talavera, which they won, but the casualties that came from such were such that they ended up having to retreat back into Portugal, where they were pursued by the French army. But because Wellington had built the lines of Torres Vedras, this line of fortifications that goes all the way from the coast to a huge river just in front of Lisbon. So the French army waits in this sort of dead zone that Wellington had created by implementing a sort of scorched earth policy, leaving no forage for the French army. And because the French marshal had decided to sit there and just suffer from disease and starvation for a deal of time, they'd now retreat back into France, and Wellington was following them for this next campaign season. To get to Madrid, which is the ultimate goal of the campaign, you need to take a number of forts along the main roads, because in this time, infrastructure isn't how we think of it today. You essentially would have very few main roads that would run through the country that would be good for arms. And so if you put forts on those roads, you need to take those forts, because your supply lines aren't going to be able to move past. Two of forts along these lines are Ciudad Rodrigo, which they took, which Britain had about 600 odd casualties in that attack, which wasn't particularly terrible in the grand scheme of things, but it was worse than it should have been, because the French fought particularly bitterly, and they even, I think, exploded a mine in one of the breaches, which killed a fair few British soldiers. But the next fort along the line after that was Badajoz, which was an old fort. It was in the old style, because it was built very much like what you would imagine from medieval times. It's this large, star fort on the cliff face, which was not the style of that time, because cannons had got so effective that you don't want these large imposing structures. Cannons knock them down. So you'd rather have these flat, smaller forts with what are called glacis, which is essentially an earthwork, which means that, cannonballs can't directly hit the wall because of this rise in the ground. And obviously these would be close enough to the walls that if you actually did try to put cannons up there, they would be under musket fire, and that would make it basically impossible. So they set up a siege on Badajoz and did bombard it. They created two practicable breaches, so when you create a breach, is obviously you knock the walls down. You would get to the point where they'd bombarded it enough that the engineers would judge it to be practicable, which means that a soldier can scale the breach without having to use his hands. Obviously, you want to be able to hold your musket as you're advancing, and if you're having to sort of scramble, that makes it much harder to do it. So there were two practicable breaches at Badajoz, and because the force that Wellington had left to garrison Ciudad Rodrigo was not that huge, and a French army was coming down from the north, they were rushed. And so Wellington decided to attack very soon, which succeeded, but it is one of the blood. I think it's not the bloodiest battle of the Peninsula War, but it's definitely up there, especially as far as British soldiers go, because they attacked on 4 sides. They attacked 2 practicable breaches, and they also had 2 of the other divisions scaling the walls on either side of that with ladders, which, if you can imagine this large looming structure, is absolutely awful. And the French had set up quite a few defences because the British had not been there for long. It was not a long siege. I think it was maybe a couple of weeks, if that. But the French had had enough time to fill these breaches with all manner of terrible implements, like I can't remember what they were called, but they had these things that look almost like, if you imagine the Hedgehog anti-tank trap from World War II, but it's essentially a small wooden implement that just has swords stuck all over it, and they would place those in the breaches, along with just having sharpshooters. And so when the light divisions were sent into those breaches, it was absolutely awful. There's a chapter in Sharp's Company where they have Sharp in one of the breaches, and Bernard Cornwell, I think, captures the image very well by, it almost sounds like the sort of thing that you hear from World War One. This kind of absolutely awful, just men are getting absolutely cut to pieces, but it's not by machine guns, by cannons loaded with grape shot. This next quote that I'm going to read comes from Wellington after he did the breaches at Badajoz. Wellington informed Liverpool that the storm of Badajoz afforms as strong an instance of the gallantry of our troops as had ever been displayed. I greatly hope that I shall never again be the instrument of putting them to such a test. He was profoundly shaken by the carnage in the breaches, where Gatton thought that it is not possible to look at those brave men, all of them dead or frightfully maimed, without recalling what they had been just a short few hours before. Wellington broke down in tears, and when Picton stumped along on his wounded leg, I bit my lip and did everything I could to stop myself, for I was ashamed he should see it, but I could not. And he so little entered into my feelings, he said, "Good God, what is the matter?" So I think what is shown there is somewhat the juxtaposition between someone who would more accurately be described as the sort of personality that is ascribed to Wellington in the example of Picton there, who was a Major General of Division in Wellington's army. I believe he's the most high-ranking Welshman in the history of the British Army. As much as I like Picton as a character, does seem a little bit heartless in a lot of he's very much the dying is what soldiers are for. He never seems to think much about it. Whereas, as is illustrated in that quote, Wellington can't help but be overcome by emotion at seeing the massive mangled body of what had been his troops. I think part of it comes down to that you hear whenever you read of this period, there's a lot of language that is used by generals which comes almost parental, where you have generals that use phrases like "my boys" a lot. There's even one of Wellington's generals in the Peninsula, Rowland Hill, got the nickname Daddy because they said he was like a father to us. He was Daddy Hill. Oh, there's one that changes under modern context. But that being said, you get people like that. I think Wellington comes more legitimately under that category, where he seems to take an almost parental role with the management of his men. Another example of this, I think, is that one of the things Wellington was most famous for is he liked positioning his troops wherever possible on a reverse slope. So whenever you have hills, he would like to position his men essentially behind the hill so that they could be shot at by cannon, which a lot of other generals of the time didn't do. There's even a quote from the time of Waterloo, obviously skipping forward quite a bit, where Wellington advises the Prussian general position his troops on a reverse slope, and I believe it's Gneisenau, who was one of the staff officers, said something along the lines of, "We're not in the habit of using that tired old dodge," which is something that I think, especially nowadays, we would consider to be quite a foolish comment. So the next part of this story that I'm trying to weave, we go forward a little bit. This is after Badajoz and after what many call Wellington's greatest victory at the Battle of Salamanca, where he almost entirely destroyed the French army there while it was manoeuvring, which, completely unrelated to what I'm talking about, is a great example of how the another cliche about Wellington, that he's simply a good defensive general and that he's somehow unimaginative or not on the same league as someone like Napoleon, that he can't fight offensive battles, is patently ridiculous. Because not only is Salamanca an offensive battle, but the manoeuvring that was done in that battle, if you're able to look at it on a map. There's a great video by Epic History TV on YouTube where they play out the whole battle in real time. You can see the way that Wellington did it. One of those events in history where he just seems to make every single correct decision at exactly the right time. They've been manoeuvring for a while on either side, sort of opposite from each other. So you've got the British on one side, the French come in on the other side of the valley. But there's a lot of rolling hills, and so the French misinterpret what they saw, and they believe that what they're looking at is Wellington's rearguard because they can't see all of the troops posted on the reverse slopes behind them. And so they believe that they can sort of hook round and by doing so cut off the British army. But in doing so, Wellington is able to fall upon the entire French army as it's manoeuvring from its flank. It's genius. Like, the story goes that Wellington had been watching them manoeuvring in the morning, waiting for the right moment, and he's sat on his horse, eating a chicken leg, and he sees just the right moment as they're moving across, and he throws the chicken leg away and he says, "By God, that'll do." And he rides off onto his left flank, where he gives the orders to his brother-in-law, Ned Pakenham, who was in charge of the 3rd Division, which was Picton's division, but because Picton was wounded at Badajoz, they roll up the French army, and they keep going. But the whole effort sort of falls apart. A fort called Burgos. Now, this is one of the battles that people bring up as being, because it was offset at the time that Wellington never lost a battle. And that is true, but there are compelling arguments to be made that something like Burgos is a defeat because they weren't able to take the town. They took severe casualty, about 2,000 casualties all told, to trying to take the town, and were then outmaneuvered, or not outmaneuvered, but the French army was bearing down on them such that they had to simply turn back and return to Portugal because the position was untenable by this time. So this is possibly Wellington's darkest hour as they're on the retreat, because no one's ever happy when you're on a retreat, and as well as that, it was coming into late autumn, so it's cold. It's wet. Basically, everyone's miserable about the whole affair, that they've just taken severe casualties and now they're having to essentially run away, which soldiers are never particularly happy. So this next quote, which I'm looking to read, which is also from Wellington the Iron Duke, recounts the reaction to the death of one of Wellington's quite prominent lower officers. "There was not much geniality in Wellington that autumn. However, for MacGregor observed, this was a period of his life where fortune seemed to turn her back on him. He decided to push Clausel towards the French border, but the northern town of Burgos, capital of Old Castile, and recently reinforced on Napoleon's orders, stood in his way. Wellington was ill prepared for a siege with only 3 heavy guns, Thunder, Lightning, and Nelson, which had lost one of its trunnions, and little enough ammunition even for them. The French field army declined to attack his covering force and bring on a general engagement. He took some outlying defences, but lost over 2,000 men to 623 French. By the time he decided to break up the siege on 21st of October 1812, amongst the casualties was Major the Hon, Edward Somers Cox, eldest son of John Lord Somers, killed by a point-blank musket shot while leading the light companies of the Highland Brigade in an assault on the main wall, retaken by the French in a sortie. Many officers agreed with John Mills that his loss was irreparable. He had commanded the troops of the 16th Light Dragoons with outstanding success for 2 years before becoming a major in the 79th Highland. One of his brother officers in the 16th, Lieutenant William Tompkinson, told how the men in his troop were very fond of him and would holloa when in the charge, "Follow the captain, stick close to the captain." He had always been so lucky in the heat of fire that I fancied he would be preserved to the army. He was a particular favourite of Wellington's, brave, well-connected and devoted to his profession. He had spent some time as one of his directed telescopes, an outpost officer charged with long-range reconnaissance and confidential missions. His loss shook Wellington to the very core. When he heard of it, he entered the room of Colonel Frederick Ponsonby, one of his staff, paced around, and then said, "Cox was killed last night." but could not utter another word. They buried him in the 79th camp in the presence of the officers of the 16th Light Dragoons and the 79th. Wellington attended with all his staff, but was so overwrought that nobody dared speak to him. He is regretted by the whole army, wrote Tomkinson, and in those regiments in which he has been, no man can lament a brother more than they do him. Wellington told Lord Somers that had he lived, the young man would have been one of the greatest ornaments of his profession, an honour to his family, and an advantage to his country. So I think that quote demonstrates quite well the sort of closeness that Wellington had with a lot of his staff officers that worked alongside him, especially the ones that were very confident and good at the job. And like I say, it reinforces that theme of family. The sort of Henry V's band of brothers, in a sense, that all of these men worked together for years, because they're in the peninsula from 1810 to 1814. It's nearly half a decade that these men are working together. And occasionally, as they're in a dangerous profession, occasionally the luck runs out. And that seems to affect Wellington quite a lot, despite obviously being a soldier and these things being almost expected. That if you go leading a company into a charge, it's not impossible or even unexpected that you might get struck down. But that doesn't stop Wellington from having a great deal of feeling, which it brings to mind, at least for me, the contrasting quote from Napoleon to the Emperor of Austria that you cannot hope to stop me, I spend 30,000 lives a month. I feel like that paints a particular difference between the kind of depth of feeling that Wellington has and Napoleon seems to lack. So I'm going to skip ahead a fair bit because the next quote I have is after the Peninsular War is wrapped up. So anyone who's familiar with the story of Napoleon knows that his retreat from Russia, which actually the beginning of his retreat from Moscow and him being turned back coincides with the Battle of Salamanca, which I talked about earlier, which is, I find, an interesting thematic parallel, that they're almost on the same day, that all of Napoleon's fronts sort of turn against him at the same time. So you have Wellington's incredible victory against the French in Spain at the same time that Napoleon's Grand Armée is being turned back and begins that long retreat from Russia, from which the around 58,000 men that Napoleon started out with, he comes back with about 40. That's 40,000. And so it's it's not a slow death, it's a rapid death for Napoleon, because as much as he regains a lot of the old magic that he had in his earlier campaigns and that he sort of lost in that time, there's the sort of desperate defence of Germany that culminates in the Battle of Leipzig, and then in France, he's eventually forced to abdicate, which is great news to Wellington. I believe he's been quoted that when he heard that Napoleon had abdicated, he spontaneously breaks out into a jig where he starts clicking his fingers and tapping his feet in moves which I've seen compared to the Carlton dance from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And I find it rather hard to argue with that point. So the war's over, and now because the British Army in this time period is an entirely volunteer army, which a lot of the armies of Europe were before this time, leading up until the French Revolution, because it's the army of the French Revolution, which is the direct predecessor to Napoleon's army, is the first properly conscript army, because before then you have the limited warfare of the previous eras where you have these small professional armies directed by emperors and kings, which the British would very much stay in the mould of, because obviously Britain's never been a major land power. It was being more of a naval power. I think the doctrine of the British Navy has often been that it is an instrument to be launched by the Royal Navy, so it can never really be too large that the Royal Navy wouldn't be able to transport it to wherever it needs to go. So the army at this time, now that the war in the peninsula is over, enters into what nowadays we would call downsize. So they put a lot of the officers on half pay and they make a lot of the soldiers redundant. But they take a lot of the other divisions and move them around to other theatres of the British Empire where they're more needed. And one of these is led by Wellington's brother-in-law, Ned Pakenham, who is promoted at the end of the war to be a general of an expedition to New Orleans in the rather hilariously titled War of 1812, considering this is December 1814. And it's in this exposition that Ned Pakenham's killed, rather tragically, after the peace between England and America had actually been signed. It just hadn't reached America yet, because obviously needs to travel on a sail ship, which takes weeks to cross. And he's leading his men forward, attacking an American fortification. When he's shot through the spine, very sadly dies. This strikes chord with Wellington because he was very close with Ned. Ironically, not because he's his wife's brother, because he seemed to have not actually liked his wife that much. I think Bernard Cornwell puts it quite well in his book on Waterloo, where he sums it up in a line that Wellington loved women, apart from his wife, who he detested. But Wellington actually, they reckon, or rather Richard Holmes, I think, reckons that Ned Pakenham, in a lot of ways, was the glue that sort of held Wellington's marriage together for a long time. Because, obviously, divorce in that time period was not the done thing, so there's never really a question that he would divorce his wife. But the kind of peace in the household in that time period seems to have been informed almost by the fact that Wellington was so close to Ned that he warmed up to his wife, which is a bit bizarre, really. In terms of, we think about how relationships work today, you don't see a lot of that sort of thing. My next quote is from Wellington himself, because not only was he distraught at the death of his very good friend, but he was absolutely furious with the admiral who was in charge of the expedition, because it was sort of a split command. Because obviously going over to America, you've got an army element and a navy element, and so Ned was in charge of the army element, and this admiral was in charge of the navy element. And Wellington, to put it lightly, seems to believe that he dropped the ball. We have but one consolation, that he fell as he lived, the honourable discharge of his duty, and distinguished himself as a soldier and as a man. I cannot but regret that he was ever employed on such service, or with such a colleague. The expedition to New Orleans originated with that colleague, and plunder was its object. The Americans were prepared with an army in a fortified position, which still would have been carried if the duties of others, that is of the admiral, had been as well performed as that of whom we lament. But Providence performed it otherwise, and we must submit. So, about a year passes after this point, as Napoleon is in exile on the island of Elba, and Wellington ends up taking up a post first as the military governor of Paris, and then later as a British ambassador, replacing Lord Castlereagh in the negotiations between the various allied nations of what the state of Europe was going to look like now that Napoleon had been deposed and they were trying to restore the Bourbon monarchy. It was another Louis, I can't remember. So this goes on for about a year, if you can believe it. Politicians quibbling about small points for an extended period of time. So long, in fact, that Napoleon returns in a more sensical way than certain other great dictators you might be aware of. That's besides the point. So Napoleon returns and reinstates his government pretty much just by power of charisma. It's really incredible. It's the sort of thing where if you made it up, you would say you were ridiculous. And the fact that he walks out in front of the army that he sent to arrest him under Marshal Ney, one of his former marshals, walks out in front of them, holds his arms out, and says, "Soldiers of the Faith, you know me. If any one of you thinks you can kill your emperor, here I am." And they all just defect over to his side. Although this is as much down to mismanagement by the Bourbons as it is to Napoleon. I believe they ended up calling the initial parts of the Bourbon Restoration the Second Terror, because the purging of and revenge against figures that were left over from the French Revolution was almost as bitter as the initial overthrowing of the monarchy in the late 1700s. So Wellington is in the perfect position at this time to lead an Anglo-Dutch army against Napoleon as he's stationed in Brussels, which is not yet Belgium, but is at this time the Kingdom of the Netherlands, but is formerly French territory. You see, that part of northern France was carved off and incorporated into the Kingdom of the Netherlands under the Prince of the Netherlands, who, I can't remember his name, but I remember that his nickname was the Old Frog. And his son, actually, the Prince of Orange, was on Wellington's staff during the Peninsular War. So Napoleon gets the better of Wellington to begin in terms of the manoeuvre, because he manages to do pretty much exactly what he wants to begin with, drives a wedge between the British and Prussian armies, but doesn't manage to completely defeat them in the way that he probably would have liked, because the Prussians are broken, but in such a way that they're able to reform, and Blucher, the head of the Prussian army, promises to assist Wellington and to meet up with him at a position called Mont Saint Jean, and this leads to the Battle of Waterloo, which is not the worst battle of the period, because if you go for numbers, there's Borodino, there's Leipzig. More men died, but Waterloo was particularly terrible, mainly for the fact that just the percentages, because the amount of staff officers and troops that die in the Battle of Waterloo in a space of ground that's only about 3 miles across, I think. It's unlike anything or really much from the period. And I believe a lot of historical sources that talk about it will compare some of the French cannonades and the British troops having to stand pretty much all day under intense cannon and howitzer fire to what British troops would suffer in the First World War of just having to stand there and being bombarded. I believe there was a division on the left flank who couldn't be sheltered from the guns as much as a lot of the other ones were because of just the nature of the terrain. And because of that, they ended up losing about, I think, a third of their entire strength before they'd even fired a shot or come into combat. I mean, it's horrific, just having to stand there for hours, and occasionally a cannonball will come over and just smash a hole in your line. And a great deal of the general staff were killed in that fight. Picton was killed, Gordon was killed. And a lot of these were men that Wellington had known for a very long time, who'd fought with in the peninsula. And just the extent of it is something that I can't imagine having to deal with. I'll go out on a limb and say that you listeners wouldn't be able to put yourself in that kind of situation. And just the mind-numbing effects of having that entire battle, and not just the battle, the days leading up to it, because I believe some sources reckon that in period leading up to the Battle of Waterloo, it's about 3 days. Wellington got maybe 9 hours sleep throughout all of it because he was so busy. Because Wellington didn't delegate anything if he could help it. At one point in the book that I've been quoting from, Richard Holmes says that Wellington has all the symptoms of what in modern times we would call a control freak. And I think that's not entirely unfair. Although there are some justifications for it where he would try to delegate tasks to other people who, to put it politely, don't share his genius and they make a pig's ear of it. So I can imagine if you're as good as he is and you're aware of how good you are, which he almost certainly was, or he certainly Paul, quote from Bernard Cornwell, quite rightly said that Wellington was a vain man with much to be vain about. I probably would be less willing to delegate if I could help it either. So this next quote that I'm going to read comes from directly after the battle, where Wellington broke the French army, rode back to his headquarters a few miles away, and had to lie down on a pallet because he gave up his bed to General Gordon, who would die in the night from a cannonball that knocked his leg off. It took him hours, but he was down. And so Wellington had to just lay down on a pallet in his headquarters and just, from the sources, just immediately went to sleep, which I'm sure we've all been tired, but I don't think any of us have been that tired. And so this next quote comes from the Surgeon General of his army, who walked him to tell him about the casualty figure, the butcher's bill, as they would call it at the time, and this is what he said happened. As I entered, he sat up, his face covered with the dust and sweat of the previous day, and extended his hand to me, which I took and held in mine. Whilst I told him of Gordon's death and of such casualties as had come to my knowledge, he was much affected. I felt the tears dropping fast upon my hand, and looking towards him saw them chasing one another down in furrows over his dusty cheeks. He brushed them away suddenly with his left hand, and said to me in a voice tremulous with emotion, "Well, thank God I don't know what it is to lose a battle, but certainly nothing can be more painful than to gain one with the loss of so many of one's friends." And so Waterloo brings an end to Wellington's military career as a general. That is his last battle, and it's after this point that he moves into political life and ultimately becomes Prime Minister, although rather unsuccessfully. As turns out, you can't quite run Parliament in the same way as you run an army, because people won't do what you say. And this is also, which I believe even the way that we've used it in what I assume will be the title of this video, the Iron Duke epitaph, is not from what a lot of people might assume it would be, because while it would be entirely appropriate to call Wellington the Iron Duke based on his demeanour and his cold steadfastness and reliability, it was actually a jest from the tabloid press over the fact that because of the unpopularity of some of the laws that he brought in as Prime Minister, he had to install iron railings on the windows of his London home because mobs would come and throw rocks to break the windows, which there's also another story of that time where he disperses one of the crowds by getting on the roof of his house with a blunderbuss and firing it in the air. Which, if you don't understand already that I have a great reverence and love for this man, that's one of the reasons. So that was Wellington's last battle. And I don't think that's something he would be particularly torn up about, because in a lot of the sources that I've read and the idea that I get of the man, he seems to not enjoy soldiering very much. Like there's a quote from one of the Civil War generals, I can't remember, the American Civil War generals, I can't remember which one, it might have been Lee, where he said that it is a good job that war is so terrible lest we fall in love with it. And I don't think Wellington was ever really in love with the idea of war. He seemed to look on it more... I mean, initially there's certainly the aspect of increasing his social standing and applying a set of skills that he has to make his mark become a great man, and to get out of debt, for one thing. Because when he went to India, it was like over £500 in debt, which I think is equal to about £50,000 in modern money. Don't you love inflation? But the more it goes into it, it's that core that I keep alluding to, that core of sympathy and of feeling, which, as a contrast, I believe is entirely lacking in Napoleon. Because Napoleon does seem to be in love with war. He seems to love being a general, and he seems to love being out on campaign. Wellington, not so much. And I think this last quote, because Waterloo is really what does it for him. Even years after, he's clearly very emotional about his memories of them. Not even necessarily in a way that, well, yeah, possibly in the sense of post-traumatic stress disorder, because despite what a lot of depictions of the time, Wellington was in the thick of it throughout basically the entire battle. Well, he wasn't fighting. He was just directing actions, but wherever the hotspot of the battle was, he'd be there on his horse. Like, he'd be in the cavalry, he'd be in the infantry squares when the French cavalry were charging, and he'd be stood directing the infantry movements, getting shot at, which is one of the reasons why his general staff suffered such high casualties, because he would be so far forward that someone would just get hit. Like, I can't remember who it was, but one of them was hit by a cannonball in the back and knocked off his horse. The source says, I believe, that he was launched out of his saddle and flew about 6 feet. That poor fellow, I believe, took about 3 days to die. So I think this last quote really drives home the idea that Wellington is very much done with soldiering at this point. He's happy to move into other aspects of life. This is taken from a conversation with his brother's wife. I hope to God, he said one day, that I fought my last battle. It is a bad thing to always be fighting. While in the thick of it, I am too occupied to feel anything, but is wretched just after. It is quite impossible to think of glory. Both mind and feelings are exhausted. I am wretched even at the moment of victory, and I always say that next to a battle lost, the greatest misery is a battle gained. Not only do you lose those dear friends with whom you have been living, but you are forced to leave the wounded behind you. To be sure, one tries to do the best for them, but how little that is. At such moments, every feeling in your breast is deadened. I am now just beginning to retain my natural spirits, but I never wish for any more fighting. So that brings to an end, I won't call it a lecture, thought piece on the Duke of Wellington, and I hope I've done a job to convey the heart of the man that I think has been lost to popular history in a lot of ways, because you see the statues, you see the imperiousness, the long nose, the chiseled jaw, the expression of the Iron Duke as we remember him. But what I've tried to express is what in my readings has really made me fall in love with the man as a character and as a person. I think why he is one of the great heroes of English history. And well, I'm happy to hear if any of you would like to say anything to the contrary, or perhaps give your own opinions. Well, I don't know how to end this particular point, so ta-ta.